There is a strange kind of suffering that does not come from reality. It comes from rehearsal. A person sits quietly in a room and loses a battle that has not happened yet. They imagine humiliation before speaking, failure before trying, loss before loving, pain before living, and without realizing it, they begin trembling before ghosts, not real ghosts, imagined ones. My friend, have you ever noticed how the human mind can create storms out of shadows? One small uncertainty becomes catastrophe. One delay becomes disaster. One awkward interaction becomes endless overthinking at 2 a.m. The mind starts building entire tragedies from tiny fragments of possibility. And the strange part, most people call this realism, but it is not realism. It is imagination trained in the direction of fear. And today, I want to talk to you about one of the greatest hidden truths of the human mind. If you can imagine the worst case scenario, you can also imagine the best case scenario. If you can overthink pain, you can overthink possibility. If your mind is powerful enough to create anxiety from futures that do not exist, then your mind is also powerful enough to create courage before reality even arrives. Welcome back, my friend. I'm Grandpa T. Sit down for a while. The world outside is loud enough already. Everywhere you look, people are rushing, chasing, competing, panicking. But very few people are taught how to sit quietly with their own mind. And because of that, many people spend their entire lives being controlled by a storyteller living inside their own head. Tonight, we are going to talk about that storyteller. We are going to talk about fear, not the kind that protects you from real danger, not the fear that warns you about fire or keeps you from stepping off a cliff. I'm talking about psychological fear, imagined fear, the fear that whispers, "You're not enough. You're going to fail. People will laugh at you. You'll embarrass yourself. You'll never become anything." That fear. Because most people never realize something important. Fear is often just imagination that forgot how to dream positively. Your mind is not passive. It is active. It is constantly producing, constantly predicting, constantly narrating. Your mind is like a movie director working day and night. The problem is, many people hand the script to fear, and fear writes terrible stories. Fear writes endings before beginnings. Fear turns uncertainty into doom. Fear zooms in on every possible failure while ignoring every possible miracle. Have you ever noticed that? When people fear something, their imagination becomes incredibly detailed. They can describe every horrible possibility, every embarrassing outcome, every painful consequence. Their mind becomes cinematic, vivid, emotional, convincing. But when it comes to imagining success, peace, growth, love, opportunity, suddenly people say, "I don't know, that seems unrealistic." Isn't that fascinating? People will believe in imaginary disasters with absolute certainty, while doubting imaginary hope. There is an old image I want you to picture. Imagine a candle burning inside a dark room. Behind you, objects cast giant shadows onto the wall. The shadows look terrifying, huge, distorted, monstrous. But when you finally turn around, you realize the monster was created by perspective. Fear works the same way. The mind enlarges uncertainty. The mind stretches possibility into catastrophe. And eventually, people become frightened by shadows they created themselves. Not intentionally, not consciously, but habitually, because the brain learns through repetition. And most people unknowingly rehearse fear every single day. Understand this carefully. The brain believes what it experiences repeatedly, even imagined experiences. That is why someone can become anxious about situations that have never happened. The mind practiced the emotion long enough for the body to memorize it. Think about that. A person can sit safely in their room while their body reacts as if danger is already happening. Heart racing, hands shaking, chest tightening, stomach sinking. Why? Because imagination is powerful. The body listens to mental imagery. This is why athletes visualize performance. This is why elite performers mentally rehearse success. This is why trauma can affect someone long after the event ends. The brain responds to repeated emotional imagery. Now imagine what happens when someone spends years imagining failure every day. What if I fail? What if nobody supports me? What if I'm rejected? What if I lose? What if I'm not smart enough? What if I ruin everything? That repetition becomes conditioning, and eventually, fear no longer feels like imagination. It feels like identity. Some people listening right now have been afraid for so long, they forgot what mental freedom feels like. Fear became normal. Overthinking became routine. Self-doubt became background noise, and because it became familiar, it started feeling true. But familiarity is not truth. A cage does not become freedom simply because someone has lived inside it for years. The mind is a garden. Every thought is a seed, and whether you realize it or not, you are planting something every day. Some people plant fear constantly. They water it with repetition. They feed it with attention. They expose it to endless comparison. And then one day they look around wondering why anxiety has overtaken their entire inner world. But gardens do not grow by accident. Neither do minds. If you plant despair long enough, despair grows. If you plant possibility long enough, possibility grows. And this is where life changes. The mind can be retrained. Not overnight, not instantly, but gradually. Like making a river change direction, it takes a lot of work. Now here is something most people never talk about. Negative thinking can feel strangely safe, because if you expect disappointment, you think disappointment will hurt less. So people imagine the worst to protect themselves, but what actually happens, they suffer twice, once in imagination and once in reality, if the event actually occurs. Most pain in human life is not happening in the present moment. It is happening in anticipation. People destroy today worrying about tomorrow, and tomorrow often arrives looking nothing like the nightmare they created. How many dreams have died because of imagined fear? How many relationships never began? How many businesses never started? How many dreams remained trapped inside people because fear convinced them catastrophe was guaranteed? Entire lives become smaller because imagination was pointed in the wrong direction. A storm at sea can terrify two different sailors. One panics, the other adjusts the sail. The storm is the same, the response is different. Fear is not always the enemy. Sometimes fear is simply energy waiting for direction, the heartbeat before a speech, the nervousness before change, the uncertainty before growth. That energy can become paralysis or transformation, depending on how the mind interprets it. Some people see fear and retreat. Others see fear and realize, this matters to me. So how do you retrain imagination? First, you become aware of your mental habits. You notice the stories you constantly repeat. You notice the automatic catastrophizing. You notice how quickly the mind jumps toward darkness. Awareness is the beginning of freedom. Then you begin redirecting the mind intentionally, not through fake positivity, not through denial, but through balanced imagination. Instead of saying, everything will fail, you ask, What if things improve? Instead of, I'll embarrass myself, you ask, what if people connect with my authenticity? Instead of, I'm not capable, you ask, what if I grow through experience? Notice something important. You are still imagining, but now imagination becomes constructive instead of destructive. And my friend, if this message is helping you rethink the way you see fear, subscribe to the channel, because these conversations are for people trying to rebuild themselves mentally, emotionally, and spiritually in a noisy world. And leave a comment below. What fear has your imagination been feeding lately? Sometimes the first step toward freedom is bringing hidden fears into the light. And if this video is speaking to your heart, give it a like so this message can reach someone else who may be silently battling their own mind tonight. Now, let's keep going. Fear is like standing inside a room full of mirrors. Every insecurity reflects endlessly. Every doubt multiplies, and eventually you forget which reflection is real. That is what overthinking does. It traps people in mental echo chambers. The same fears replay over and over until they feel permanent. But the mind is not meant to be worshipped blindly. Thoughts are not commandments. Not every thought deserves belief. Some thoughts are simply habits wearing the mask of truth. There is something heartbreaking about human potential. Many people never discover who they could have become, not because they lacked talent, not because they lacked intelligence, but because fear exhausted them before life even began. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack every day filled with imagined disasters. Eventually, even simple steps feel impossible. That is what chronic fear does. It drains energy, creativity, hope, action, and over time, people begin confusing emotional exhaustion with incapability. But exhaustion is not proof of weakness. Sometimes it is proof the mind has been fighting imaginary wars for too long. Now let me ask you something. What happens if you begin imagining differently? What happens if instead of rehearsing humiliation, you rehearse resilience? What if instead of imagining abandonment, you imagine meaningful connection? What if instead of imagining failure, you imagine growth, not fantasies, not delusions, possibilities? Because possibilities are just as real as catastrophes until reality decides. And many beautiful things in life only happen to people willing to imagine positively long enough to take action. One day, you will look back on your life, and I believe one of the greatest regrets a human being can experience is realizing how much suffering came from thoughts that were never true. How many nights were stolen by fears that never happened? How many opportunities were abandoned because of imagined outcomes? How much beauty was missed because the mind kept predicting darkness? My friend, fear is not always wisdom. Sometimes fear is simply imagination that lost discipline. And the beautiful thing about discipline is that it can be learned. So the next time fear enters your mind, pause for a moment and ask yourself, if my imagination is powerful enough to create this fear, could it also create courage? Because both are imagined before they are felt. And perhaps the greatest transformation in life is not eliminating imagination, but teaching it to work in your favor instead of against you. The mind is like a fire. Left unattended, it can burn down your peace, but guided carefully, it can light your path through darkness. Train your imagination wisely. Protect what you repeatedly feed your mind. And remember, if you can imagine the worst-case scenario, you can also imagine a future more beautiful than your fear currently allows you to see. I'm Grandpa T, and until next time, Be careful what stories you rehearse inside your mind, because eventually the mind starts believing the stories it hears most often.